Hello, all viewers of this here YouTube video. It is I, Ophidian of the Heavens, and today we may as well get straight to the point as I bring you a review of the new Soulmass album, The Weakness of Virtue. Two reviews in relatively close proximity is cool and good, as they do say in my home country, and hopefully many more will follow in quick succession, but for now we will focus on the topic at hand. Soulmass are a death doom band from the American state of Florida, and have been active since 2013 or so. The Weakness of Virtue is their second full-length album, and in keeping with the band's theme, all of the songs within are centered around the Dark Souls trilogy. You could say they're the Dark Souls of Death Doom bands. Please don't kill me for making that awful joke, it was necessary, I swear. But anyways, the band are evidently big fans of the Souls series, which I appreciate considering I am a fan of the games as well. Evidently, the band seems to know a lot more lore-wise than I do, though, but we'll get into that later. The original two band members, their vocalist and lyricist Brian, and their primary instrumentalist Brett, are both obviously still on the album, though this time they have a new percussionist, Steve Scudero, I'm presuming, and a new bassist, Aaron Sluss, though not exactly a fully connected concept or story album necessarily. The album does center around many lore components of the Dark Souls series, as prior mentioned, and seems to have some interconnection between some of the songs at the least. Furthermore, the music on the album is pretty amazing, and is undoubtedly one of the better metal releases I have heard so far this year. The lyricism on this album is not only quite impressive in its own right, but blends perfectly into the Dark Souls lore and the either heavy and aggressive or bleak and depressive atmosphere that the album is mostly surrounded by. There are often many quotes used from the dialogue of certain Dark Souls characters, particularly those that the songs are based around. As I did mention earlier, the band knows their lore and characters and such pretty well, and since I'm not as familiar as I would like to be with the Souls games, I had to dive into some stuff for the lyrics on this album, but it was fairly worth it since I think I discerned most of what went down. In order, I believe the primary references of the songs are as follows. To Paint a New World is based on the Ashes of Ariandel DLC from Dark Souls 3, and this one was somewhat obvious, thankfully. Blacksmith's Wisdom is actually based around the smith in Dark Souls 2, Steady Hand Macduff, as it uses quite a bit of his dialogue. Praise the Sun is also an extremely obvious one, since it's based around Solaire. Remember My Name is about an undead character called Lucatiel of Mira in Dark Souls 2. A Once Proud Knight is about Sigmar of Katarina, though this one was admittedly one of the hardest to get since the only direct reference was in the very last line of the song. Spear and Hammer is a more obvious one and is about Ornstein and Smaug. Then the last three songs seem to have a bit more of an overarching connection to each other, all more or less linking specifically into the main overarching story of Dark Souls themselves. When the Flame Begins to Fade mostly details the prelude to the first Dark Souls game, primarily covering the opening cutscene with like the war between the gods and the dragons. The First Sin is, as the title implies, about the concept of the first sin in Dark Souls, in this case being when Gwyn linked the fire and created the Curse of Undeath. And finally, there is Embrace of the Gathering Darkness, which seems to follow the primary story of Dark Souls 3. It ends with the secondary ending, wherein the Ashen One lets the flame finally fade, which I find fitting, as not only does this go along with the much more bleak atmosphere this album has overall, but it's also essentially the best ending, all things considered. Either way, it's an extremely suiting ending to the album, and evidently a lot went into the lyricism and overall theme and concept of this album. As mentioned prior, the band does have some new instrumentalists this time around, and it is fairly evident within the music. Brett still does an amazing job with the guitars as usual, with some very, very nice guitar tone overall on this thing, as well as spicy riffing and some pretty damn good solos throughout, not to mention the fairly impressive leads we get here and there. Also, a decent chunk of the riffs and melodies have some fairly progressive tendencies, making them quite a bit more interesting. The acoustic bits we get here and there are quite quality as well, giving some nice build-up. The new bassist, Aaron, does a really good job here, as not only is the bass much more present, but there are some rather technical passages for it, which are quite appreciable overall. The percussion here is also evidently more of a step up, with some much more interesting and impressive fills than in previous works, and overall the level of technicality and songwriting for the drums is ultimately a pretty good improvement from their debut, I'd say. And naturally, the vocals on this thing are still pretty damn great. The death metal-based harshes are pretty great, primarily filling out the lower register and having some really good impact for the most part. On top of that, there are some higher harshes here that get interwoven pretty well and are both very fitting and I'd say even more intense than the lower vocals, which definitely helps some of the more aggressive moments, or when swapping between character perspectives throughout the songs, for instance. Furthermore, the guest vocals by Mercedes Victoria for the final track of the album are stunningly beautiful. I was pretty floored the first time I heard them. Extremely well implemented and very talented clean vocals there. Overall, the performances on this album are more than up to par as far as I'm concerned, and the band have definitely grown more since their last release. As for the actual music on this record, it is quite an impressive time. The songwriting is both consistently great throughout the album and overall extremely quality, with the peaks of this album practically being perfect, I'd say. The band tends to go for more long-form songs on the album, though there are definitely some shorter, more death metal focused tracks on here, the most prominent of which being Praise the Sun. Ultimately, though, there is much more of a doom metal approach in songwriting here, and on top of that, I would say the band follows a lot of progressive tendencies for their longer songs, especially concerning composition and the song structures present, which are rather unique for the most parts. Though there isn't an abundance of melody on the album, those that are present tend to be either more depressive, forlorn, chilling, or aggressive, and at that they are all extremely well done. I can safely say that the melodies present on here blend with the music extremely well, and are all quite memorable. Furthermore, they tend to help with building the atmosphere and feel of the songs quite well, especially those in the more acoustic sections present, as well as with Mercedes' vocals. One of the primary focuses of the album, though, is the riffing. The riffing on here is undeniably heavy as fuck, with the longer, more doom metal-y riffs tending to have quite a depressive and crushing effect on the listener, and the more aggressive and foreboding death metal riffs tending to be just as effective at pumping the listener up. Some solid use of tremolos as well, which is always a fun time. Ultimately, the riffs on this album are all composed very well, and more often than not are extremely effective in creating the wanted feel for the song, as well as being very memorable. The solos on this album, whilst also not super frequent, are pretty fucking lit when they kick in, so that's always a good time as well. On top of that all, the percussion, as mentioned earlier, has some very nice songwriting here, generally being quite more improved and having more interesting fills. Overall, the songwriting for this thing is pretty damn great, and definitely lends itself to the atmosphere quite well at that. Speaking of the atmosphere, it is definitely a primary focus, as one would expect from a Death Doom album, especially one of this caliber. It is quite effective at that, and ranges quite well too, going from bleak, desolate, and dismal to very aggressive, heavy, and vigorous. Furthermore, there are definitely points on the album where one will blend into the other almost seamlessly, which is quite impressive. Overall, though, the atmosphere for this album can be summed up in pretty much one word: dark. Just as with the ending that this album goes for, you get the sense of gradually fading flame a lot of the time, and ultimately it ties very well with the whole Dark Souls thematic they have going on, ultimately outdoing their previous work by quite a bit in that department, I'd say. The emotions that the atmosphere invokes range pretty much along with the atmosphere itself, generally again going from more aggressive feels to more depressive feels. Ultimately, though, the band's compositional style lends almost perfectly to the general atmosphere here, and furthermore entwines just as well with the atmosphere of the Souls series. The production on the album also helps quite a bit in that regard. It's got a reasonably dense feel to it, with some nice reverb here and there that certainly spikes up the impact of a lot of the sections, especially the riffs and melodies. Absolutely nothing feels buried either, which is great. I have basically no complaints about the mix at all, and the murkier production overall coats both the instrumentals and vocals very well when needed, and lets them shine through very clearly when necessary, such as with Mercedes' vocals on the final track, for instance. Basically no complaints at all about production or atmosphere on this record, both are pretty damn great. And next we get into that classic track-by-track section, and this album being as long as it is, we may be here for a little while. To Paint a New World is, as previously mentioned, a song about the Ashes of Ariandel DLC for Dark Souls 3, and has references to the Bug Boys, the Forlorn Corvians, Sir Wilhelm, the Painter, and Ariandel all throughout. The intro starts off more calm and somewhat chilling, a nice acoustic passage that ultimately builds its way up to the then explosive and heavy riffing, which slowly declines again into a more bleak yet much more grim section, wherein we get some quality vocal lines urging us to forget the fire. We go back and forth between this bleakness and the intense riffing for a few moments as we are further urged to stay in this quiet, dark place. Of course, things start getting more intense as the fight with Wilhelm hits us, with some cool vocal variants and much more aggressive riffing, very impressive percussion, and memorable melodies. This leads us on to the fight with Ariandel, again with rivaled intensity, before slowing back down into a more Doom-like section again as we complete the painter's wish to allow her to paint a new world, ultimately finishing off the track. Certainly a very strong opening track, and a good way to set the tone of the album. Blacksmith's Wisdom is much more of a death metal track from right out of the gates, with some pretty fast-paced, heavy riffing that leads us right into the song, the vocals flaring in over top of them to add some nice intensity as we progress, getting into some more variety with the riffing, yet persisting with the tempo and intensity of the song. The vocals break off as we get into some spicier riffing before returning back to a more verse-like section with the vocals and riffing. As prior mentioned, the song is entirely based around the Dark Souls 2 Smith, Steady Hand to Macduff, and you can hear some of his dialogue quoted on here as well. The percussion helps vary things up a lot on here, which is pretty nicely done as well. Ultimately, quite an intense track to lead off from the intro, though if I had any complaint here it would be that there's a tad much repetition where it doesn't feel entirely necessary, even if the whole song stands still quite well, and the riffs don't tend to get old too easily. Praise the Sun is, as mentioned, the song about Solaire, and this one is also much more straight death metal, though this time with much more memorable riffing in my opinion. We start off with more blazing aggressive riffs, which again are quite damn memorable and fairly intense as well, before leading into the verses which in no way diminish the intensity as we get the addition of the vocals. Percussion on here definitely helps keep things extremely spicy, with very memorable and entertaining fills overall. The lead melody on the chorus of this thing, or what I'm presuming is the chorus I guess, is extremely catchy as well and fits in super well. The solo on this thing is also damn impressive, and ultimately the song is probably my favorite of the more straightforward death metal tracks on here. Furthermore, the whole dark atmosphere of the song is certainly furthered by the fact that the lyrics basically imply Solaire's ending where he goes insane and then is killed, so yeah, sad feels there. Remember My Name starts as a much more doom metal focused track from the last two, with some very nice build-up and heavy riffing, a fairly foreboding atmosphere accompanying the intro. This then builds into some more death metal-y riffing, with some good intensity and fairly cool structuring, despite being some of the less interesting riffing on the album at first, I'd say. The riffs do end up getting a bit more varied and interesting as things go on, though, keeping up that intense feel and blending more heaviness into it. It drops back into some more slower doom metal riffing for a bit before kicking back into a much faster-paced, more aggressive version of the same riff, bridging the doom metal and death metal gap fairly well, I'd say. The song ends off with another fairly heavy riff, which also slowly drops in tone, essentially losing its energy as it reaches the end of the song, which is quite a cool representation of the lyrics, considering the song is based around Lucatiel, a character from Dark Souls 2 that eventually goes hollow and forgets you, and wants you to remember her name as her last words, hence the song title. A Once Proud Knight is the song based around Sigmar of Katarina, who ends up going hollow and loses himself to bloodlust. It has a more methodical build-up, having a bit of a mixture of doom and death metal as it starts off with a fairly heavy and crushing, more mid-tempo riff, and keeps this tempo as the riffing changes up a bit, the vocals again adding to the intensity pretty well here, driving things forward more or less. The percussion varies even more than the riffing here, which is quite welcomed, as it leaves a great feeling of progression for most of the song. We get treated to some nice, more forlorn melodies on this one as well, which are rather subdued in comparison to the riffing and vocals at first, which definitely adds to the somewhat suppressed vibe that I feel they're going for here. The song progresses further as Sigmar loses himself and becomes a hollow, and has a nice lead melody near the end of the track, which adds to the whole depressing vibe, I guess. Again, though, I feel like the song goes on a bit longer than necessary for something with more of a mid-tempo and a bit of a lack of variance overall. The next track we have is Spear and Hammer, and as the title somewhat implies, it is about Ornstein and Smaug. It starts off very death metal-y from the song's intro, leading with some intense galloping riffs and burning into some other very heavy and aggressive riffing, before returning to the initial riff, all of it being quite memorable at that. We get treated to some nice tremolos on this song as well, and some extremely welcome lead melodies that are very catchy and work perfectly with the riffing and percussion on here, which are both really nicely varied and quite catchy in and of themselves. The song seems based more around the actual fight of Ornstein and Smaug, and definitely gives off that general feel overall. It also seems that in this song Ornstein is the first boss to fall, and when he does there is some pretty intense riffing to signify the transition into Mega Smaug. The riffing continues before suddenly dropping off into a much slower, down-tempo, more crushing riff, as the player is literally crushed beneath Mega Smaug's hammer, which definitely gives off a really heavy feel as the song then fades off. Definitely one of the more well-constructed tracks on the album in my opinion. When the flame begins to fade is the start of the final trilogy of songs, and as mentioned earlier, it covers the preemptive lore and the opening cutscene of Dark Souls 1. It starts off fairly heavy and down-tempo, showing off doom metal tendencies and treating us to a really cool and fairly intense lead melody, before bringing us into a combination of steady, dismal riffing and fairly heavy vocals. As the war between gods and dragons begins, things ramp up in tempo and intensify a little bit, though still remain roughly mid-tempo. The riffing here is definitely pretty solid and reasonably catchy as the dragons eventually fall, before once more breaking into some more great lead melodies as the chorus kicks in, reminiscent of the intro melody, yet differing. Things continue for a bit before slowing down in tempo again as the flames do in fact begin to fade. We get hit with some absolutely amazing dual melodies on top of the chorus as the song ends, being not only much more complex but giving off a way more inspiring feel. One of the shorter tracks on the album that's more doom metal focused, I'd say, and definitely one of the best. We then head into The First Sin, which starts out at a similar tempo, but quickly builds up in intensity, evidently showing off some more death metal qualities in the last song as the vocals kick in. Once they fade off, however, we get dropped straight back into the more bleak, dismal riffing, some nice subdued melodies present, before once again ramping up. This time, the intensity stays for a bit longer as the chorus kicks in, the lyricism here focused on the linking of the flames, the eternal curse of undeath that Gwyn created. The song seems to mostly bleed from doom metal into down to mid-tempo death metal, shifting back and forth pretty effectively, especially on the back half of the track where this thing slows down monumentally, giving us some very heavy riffs and bringing in some great bleak melodies to progress things wonderfully. The riffing once again kicks up as the flame begins to fade, causing the curse of undeath to return, cementing humanity's place of slavery to the first sin. We once again get some very nice melodies atop the vocals and riffing here, the whole depressing, hopeless atmosphere being quite piercing overall. The guitars slowly fade out, leaving just the percussion, bass, and vocals, before the percussion drops as well, the song slowly fading off from there, leading into the final track of the album. Embrace of the Gathering Darkness is both the last track on here and my personal favorite. It essentially tells the main tale of Dark Souls 3, and starts off with some very nice acoustic melody, slowly building up an atmosphere that then leads into the bass, percussion, and absolutely incredible clean vocals from Mercedes Victoria. The bass line here is actually quite notable and very nice at that. The percussion focusing on primarily driving the rhythm as the acoustic guitar echoes off into the background for a bit, Mercedes' vocals ringing out into the darkness with an unrivaled beauty. Things temporarily pick up as the acoustic guitars draw back in, giving us some very nice and memorable melodies as the drums and Mercedes pick up in tempo as well, before returning to the more verse-like section, this time with some of Mercedes' most memorable vocal melodies and lines, I'd say. This picks up again not too long after, the clean vocals eventually fading off as the start of the actual riffing comes in, before picking back up for a little bit, still as haunting as ever over the more dismal, heavier riffing this time. The riffs then shift, picking up in pace as the harsh vocals return, everything slowly building up further in intensity and heaviness from there. Furthermore, the riffing here is pretty damn catchy, some of the best on the album, I would argue. We get treated to more acoustics as the song slows down a bit, this time laced over top the riffs, things picking up not too long after, the acoustics persisting as the percussion ramps up and the vocals return, before shifting into some beautiful, memorable lead melodies. The riffing here once again builds such an amazing feel as it goes on, and despite the bleakness throughout, there is a notable feeling of beauty throughout the track, which I presume somewhat signifies the peace that comes from the cycle of flame eventually being broken. Things get a bit more intense again as the song continues, with the intensity starting to peak as the Ashen One gains the resolve to break the curse of undeath, rejecting the deception of outside forces. Things slow down a little as we get nearer to the end, before peaking slightly again with that final fight between the Ashen One and the Soul of Cinder. The riffing here is extremely memorable as everything comes to a close, the flame finally fading out as the vocals repeat the line, "Without light, there are no shadows." The song itself fading out in turn, perfectly signifying the closing to the game and furthermore ending the album off beautifully. Definitely my favorite track as mentioned. Ultimately, The Weakness of Virtue is an incredible display of death doom with some great progressive tendencies, and it shows very well how much Soulmass has grown since their debut. The Dark Souls theme is entwined and executed in the music essentially perfectly, especially taking the atmosphere and lyricism into account.
All of the band members are quite talented here, and the songwriting is generally very, very good. Some nice progression on most tracks, effective song structures, and with amazing riffing and melodies overall. Furthermore, the atmosphere shrouds this album in such an effective darkness, perfectly mixing the heaviness and aggression with the bleak, dismal vibes of Dark Souls. Furthermore, the production definitely helps out a ton with this album, and there are some truly monolithic tracks on this thing. If I had any major complaint here, it would be that some tracks suffer a bit from what I feel is unnecessary repetition. I feel the length overall in this album could get cut down a little bit more without losing anything. Other than that, though, it's truly an incredible Death Doom album, and more than worthy of a 9 out of 10 rating. And with that, we conclude the review. Some damn good stuff here, though. Soulmass definitely outdid themselves for this release, and I would highly recommend checking this out, especially if you're a fan of Dark Souls or Death Doom. As always, if you liked the video, hit the like button. If you loved it, subscribe for many more future reviews and other similar content. And if you disliked it, then go ahead and tell me why in the comments. And if you feel differently about any of the points I've made in the video, I would love to discuss them below as well, since I'm a big fan of discussion and will more than readily share my detailed views. Furthermore, if you have any albums that you would like to see reviewed next, tell me in the comments as well, and if you have any changes you would like to see to the formatting here, leave a comment as well and I'll consider those, especially since I know that long-form YouTube reviews aren't exactly the most popular things. But either way, I have been Empyrean Serpent, and thank you for watching.